August 15th, 1945, 06:42 hours, San Pedro Bay, Leyte, Philippines. The sea is calm in a way it hasn't been in years. A thin mist hangs just above the waterline as a lone PT boat idles at half throttle. Its Packard engines, once screaming at 40 knots through Japanese-held waters, now rumble low and uncertain, like they're unsure if they're still needed. The crew stands loose at their stations. No helmets, no life jackets. Cigarettes burn unattended between fingers. Then, the radio crackles. Not an order, not a warning, just 3 words that drain the tension from the air like someone pulled a plug. Cease all operations. You can almost feel it, the strange, disorienting quiet that follows victory. For years, these boats lived fast and loud. Night attacks, torpedoes launched at point-blank range, machine guns hammering in the dark. Crews who slept in snatches, knowing the next patrol might be their last. But now, with the war suddenly over, no one seems quite sure what happens to weapons built for chaos when the chaos ends. The PT boat noses toward the pier. Lines are thrown. Engines shut down. And just like that, the most dangerous small warships in the U.S. Navy begin to disappear, not in flames or glory, but in silence. During the war, PT boats were everywhere. The Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, the Mediterranean. They were cheap, fast, expendable, and brutally effective in the right hands. But victory changes everything. By the fall of 1945, the U.S. Navy is drowning in hardware. Steel ships get priority, aircraft get priority. Anything made of wood, especially wood soaked in tropical rot, is suddenly a liability. You have to understand the mindset. PT boats were never meant to last. Built of wood, glued and bolted together under wartime pressure, designed for speed, not longevity. Their hulls soaked up salt water, their engines demanded constant maintenance. Their crews lived inches from gasoline fumes and ammunition. In wartime, none of that mattered. In peacetime, it mattered a lot. At bases like Samar, Tulagi, and Palermo, the same scene plays out again and again. Young officers, many barely in their 20s, receive new orders, not to patrol, not to attack, but to inventory. Serial numbers, engine hours, hull condition, armament status. The language shifts from combat reports to disposal forms. Some boats are tagged "Return to Continental United States." Most are not. The Navy's post-war planners are ruthless. Steel ships get priority. Aircraft get priority. Anything made of wood, especially wood soaked in tropical rot, is suddenly a liability.
One by one, PT boats are stripped, torpedoes removed, machine guns unbolted, radars taken off. What remains is a fast, fragile shell with no clear purpose. And then the real decisions begin. In the Pacific, the distances are enormous. Towing a PT boat home costs more than the boat itself is worth. Shipping space is already overwhelmed with troops trying to get home. Every inch of cargo space is fought over. So officers are given quiet authority. Dispose locally. It's a phrase that sounds clean, administrative, almost polite. What it means in practice is brutal. Some boats are handed over to Allied navies, Philippine patrol forces, Italian coastal units, Greek maritime police. They'll serve a few more years, patched and repainted, before quietly vanishing into scrapyards. Others are less lucky. On remote islands, crews are ordered to take their own boats out for the last time. No enemy, no mission, just a compass bearing, and enough fuel to reach deep water. The charges are set below decks. The crew climbs into a launch. A switch is thrown. There's no dramatic explosion, Just a dull, final crack as the hull gives way. The boat settles stern first, engines still warm, paint still fresh, disappearing beneath a sea it once ruled. Men who survived combat don't cheer. Some look away, because sinking a PT boat feels uncomfortably close to sinking a memory. Back in the United States, a different fate awaits. Rows of PT boats sit in reserve yards, California, Florida, New Jersey, lined up like forgotten racehorses. Their once lethal silhouettes now gather dust. Rain pools in their cockpits. Wooden decks warp and split under the sun. A few were tested, modified, briefly considered for new roles: coastal patrol, law enforcement, even pleasure craft. But the world is moving on. Jet aircraft, submarines, guided missiles. There is no doctrine for fast wooden torpedo boats in the Cold War. No place for them in the future Navy. By 1947, the disposals accelerate. Auctions are announced with little fanfare. Surplus naval craft, as is, where is. Civilians walk the decks where sailors once bled. Fishermen, entrepreneurs, scrap dealers. Some see speedboats, some see lumber, some just see a bargain. A handful of PT boats are saved by accident, bought by people who don't fully understand what they're acquiring. They'll be turned into yachts, houseboats, floating restaurants. Most will be cut apart. Chainsaws bite into hulls that once carried men into enemy fire. And here's the unsettling truth. By the time America begins mythologizing the PT boats, books, movies, legends, most of them are already gone. Not lost in battle, not preserved in museums, but erased by paperwork and practicality. The weapons that helped win the war vanish almost without trace. But one question lingers, unanswered in 1945. If these boats were so expendable, why did the men who served on them never forget them? Because the real story of the PT boats doesn't end when the war does. It only gets quieter. And in that quiet, something important is lost.
The first letters start arriving in late 1945. They're handwritten, messy, emotional, addressed not to admirals or politicians, but to forgotten offices deep inside the Navy's bureaucracy. Supply depots, surplus divisions, disposal boards. Former PT boat skippers, engineers, gunners, men who survived the war and now realizing something unsettling. The boats that define their lives are being erased. In New Jersey, a former lieutenant commander walks through a naval yard and stops cold. Row after row of PT boats sit nose to tail, paint flaking, numbers barely visible. He recognizes one instantly, not by the hull number, but by the scar along the bow where a Japanese shell once glanced off without detonating. That boat carried him through 32 patrols. It carried his crew home. Now it's tagged with a small metal placard, surplus, scrap authorized. He doesn't say anything. He just stands there longer than necessary. A yard worker clears his throat. Time to move along. This is how the war ends for most PT crews, not with parades, but with quiet disbelief. The problem is that PT boats were never just equipment, they were intimate. On a destroyer, you can disappear into the machinery of war. On a PT boat, you were always inches from everyone else. You smell the fuel, you hear the engines screaming beneath your feet, you feel every wave slam the hull 40 knots in the dark. You know every creak of the wood. Every man aboard knows that if the boat takes a direct hit, there is nowhere to go. So when these boats are scrapped, it feels personal, like losing a member of the crew. Some veterans try to save them. A few band together, pooling money to bid at surplus auctions. They imagine restoring their old boats, preserving them, maybe turning them into memorials. They quickly run into reality. The boats are fragile. Years of salt water have weakened the hulls. The Packard engines require specialized parts that are no longer being manufactured. Maintenance costs explode immediately. More than one veteran watches helplessly as the boat he tried to save slowly rots in a marina, unfinished, unfunded. Good intentions aren't enough.
Hollywood, meanwhile, begins shaping the legend. The PT boat becomes shorthand for daring and recklessness, speed, youth, audacity, a place where junior officers had outsized responsibility and survived by nerve and instinct. One name begins to rise above the rest. A former skipper with a bad back, a Boston accent, and a war story that refuses to fade. But in 1946, that future is still unclear. To most Americans, PT boats are already yesterday's news. The country is looking forward, not back. Jets roar overhead. Atomic tests light up the Pacific sky. The war that required small wooden boats to fight in the dark is over. Inside the Navy, the official verdict is final. PT boats are deemed obsolete. Not temporarily unnecessary, not awaiting a new role. Obsolete. New threats demand new tools. Submarines now operate for months underwater. Radar sees farther than any human lookout. Missiles are being tested that can strike from beyond the horizon. Speed alone is no longer enough. The Navy quietly disbands PT squadrons. Training manuals are shelved. Tactics learned through blood and trial vanish from doctrine almost overnight. By 1950, most young naval officers have never set foot on a PT boat. The knowledge dies faster than the hardware. And yet, not all of them vanish. A strange afterlife begins. In Florida, a former PT boat becomes a charter fishing vessel. Tourists drink beer on a deck once stained with oil and sweat. They ask the captain how fast she goes. He smiles, but doesn't answer directly. In California, another is converted into a private speedboat for a wealthy buyer. The torpedo tubes are removed, but the mounts remain, like phantom limbs. Guests lounge where depth charges once sat. In Europe, a handful of PT boats serve with foreign navies into the early 1950s, their American origins slowly obscured by new paint and new flags. They are ghosts wearing new uniforms. But the wood remembers. Old PT boat captains will tell you the same thing. No matter how much you modify them, the boats never quite behave like civilian craft. They pound hard in rough seas. They demand attention. They punish carelessness, as if they refuse to forget what they were built for. Then there are the rumors. Stories whispered among veterans at reunions and VFW halls about boats sold cheaply, only to be used in smuggling runs. About former PTs racing through Caribbean waters under flags of convenience. About engines screaming in the night long after the war supposedly ended. Most of these stories are impossible to verify, but they persist because it feels right. PT boats were never meant to sit still. By the mid-1950s, fewer than a dozen authentic wartime PT boats remain intact in the United States. Museums weren't ready for them. Preservation culture barely existed. Wooden warships were seen as impractical relics. And so the Navy that once relied on these boats to hold the line at night lets them slip quietly into memory. Too quietly. Because buried inside the story of what happened to America's PT boats after World War II is a deeper question that the Navy never fully answers. If these boats were so outdated, why did their spirit keep resurfacing whenever America faced unconventional war? The answer won't come from archives or auctions. It'll come from the next conflict, when the Navy finds itself once again needing speed, improvisation, and men willing to fight in the dark. The next war doesn't announce itself politely. There's no declaration, no victory gardens, no mass mobilization, just scattered reports, advisory missions, in a growing sense that something is wrong in places far from home. By the early 1950s, the U.S. Navy finds itself operating along unfamiliar coastlines again. Narrow waters, cluttered shores, enemies who don't present themselves in neat formations. And suddenly, someone asks the question no one expected to hear again. What do we have that can move fast, strike hard, and disappear? The answer, awkwardly, is not much. In Korea, destroyers and cruisers dominate the headlines, but down along the coastlines, reality looks different. Shallow waters, fishing boats, inlets and islands that swallow radar signals, targets that vanish before air support can arrive. The Navy improvises. Small craft are pressed into service. Crews adapt tactics on the fly. It works, but only partially, because something is missing. Not just speed, attitude. PT boats were built around a philosophy: decentralization. Young officers making independent decisions at night, without orders, without backup, trusting instinct as much as doctrine. Post-war Navy culture has moved in the opposite direction. Layers of command, procedures, checklists, risk mitigation. Safe, efficient, predictable, and deeply uncomfortable when the fight becomes chaotic. Veterans notice this immediately. Former PT officers, now older, some still in uniform, watch from the sidelines as the Navy struggles with problems they recognize instantly. They try to explain, they write memos, they offer lessons learned. Most of it goes nowhere. PT boats were an embarrassment to planners. They don't fit clean narratives of technological progress. They were a wartime hack that worked too well, led by young officers, with results too messy. So the institution quietly convinces itself that the PT era was an anomaly, a necessary but crude chapter, better forgotten. Then Vietnam happens, and forgetting becomes impossible. The rivers are narrow, the coastlines are cluttered, the enemy moves at night, blends into civilians, strikes, and disappears. Sound familiar? At first, the Navy sends big ships and hopes for the best. It doesn't work. Radar can't see through mangroves. Deep draft vessels are useless in shallow channels. Air power helps, but it can't be everywhere. So the Navy does something it swore it wouldn't do again. It builds small boats. Fast ones. Heavily armed ones. They aren't called PT boats, but the lineage is obvious. Swift boats, river patrol craft, shallow draft gunboats crewed by young sailors making split-second decisions in hostile waters. Old PT veterans watch the news and feel a strange mix of pride and dread. Pride because the institution has finally remembered what worked. Dread because they know exactly how dangerous this kind of warfare is. And because they know how easily these boats and their crews will be forgotten once the war ends. Again. This is the real legacy of the PT boats. Not the wood, not the engines, not even the torpedoes. It's the pattern. America builds unconventional weapons to fight unconventional wars. They work brilliantly. They save lives. They change outcomes. Then peace comes, and the nation looks away. By the 1970s, the last surviving PT boats are in rough shape. A few museums scramble to restore them, often with minimal funding and fading documentation. Volunteers argue over paint schemes. Veterans argue over details, where the guns were mounted, how the radar was wired, what the boats really sounded like at full throttle. Because memory is all that's left, and memory is fragile. There's a moment that repeats itself at nearly every PT reunion. An aging crewman runs his hand along the hull of a restored boat. The wood is smooth now, clean, almost too perfect. He nods politely. Then he steps back. Because this isn't the boat he remembers. The real one smelled of fuel and sweat. It vibrated constantly. It scared him every time he climbed aboard. And he loved it. The Navy eventually acknowledges the lesson, quietly. Modern doctrine embraces small, fast, lethal platforms again. Littoral combat ships, special operations craft, autonomous surface vessels. Different technology, same idea. But nowhere in the manuals does it say, we learned this from PT boats. That credit remains unofficial, passed down in sea stories, in reunions, in the silence between veterans who understand what it meant to fight at night in a wooden boat packed with gasoline and hope. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If another war demands it, if America once again needs speed over armor, initiative over hierarchy, someone will reinvent the PT boat, under a different name, with better sensors, and the same risks. Because the ocean hasn't changed, and neither has human nature. The PT boats didn't fail after World War II. They were abandoned. And in that abandonment lies the final haunting question, one that lingers long after the boats themselves are gone. Did America outgrow the PT boat, or did it simply forget why it needed them in the first place? There's a photograph taken in the early 1980s. No dramatic lighting, no uniforms, just an old man standing beside a wooden hull, his hand resting lightly on the rail. The boat's paint is fresh, the numbers carefully stenciled, the deck clean enough to eat off. But the man isn't smiling. He's listening. Because if you've lived long enough around PT boats, you never stop listening for engines that aren't there anymore. By the time preservation efforts finally gain momentum, it's almost too late. Out of hundreds of wartime PT boats, only a handful survive intact. Some are pieced together from multiple wrecks. Others are restored through guesswork, guided by faded photos and arguments between men who were there and men who wish they had been. Every saved boat becomes a battlefield of memory. What color was the deck? Where exactly was the 20mm mounted? Did this squadron carry radar in early '43 or later? These aren't trivial questions. They're about truth, because for the men who served on them, the PT boat isn't a symbol. It's a place, a specific night, a specific sound, a moment where the line between survival and death was measured in seconds and knots. And they know how easily that truth can be sanded smooth. The museums do their best. They tell the stories of daring night attacks, of torpedoes fired so close the crews could hear them hit, of young officers trusted with lethal autonomy in a way few would be today. Visitors nod, take photos, move on. What's harder to convey is the fear, the knowledge that if you were hit, you would burn, that gasoline doesn't forgive, that there was no armor thick enough to save you, only speed, darkness, and luck. That's the part that doesn't fit neatly on a placard. And yet, the spirit survives in unexpected places, in naval special operations, in fast attack doctrines, in the belief that small, motivated crews can punch far above their weight if given trust and freedom. The Navy may never officially say it, but the DNA is there. Every time a commander authorizes a small unit to operate independently, every time speed is chosen over protection, every time initiative is valued over rigid control. That's a PT boat decision. The final irony is this. For something the Navy discarded so quickly, PT boats refuse to stay buried. They reappear in books, in documentaries, in late-night conversations between veterans who rarely talk about the war, except when someone mentions a boat number, or an island name, or the way the sea looked just before dawn. They reappear because they represent a kind of warfare that feels dangerously human, messy, improvised, personal. Not clean lines on a map, but men making choices in the dark. And maybe that's why the question still matters. What really happened to America's PT boats after World War II? They weren't defeated. They weren't replaced by something better in spirit, only in scale. They weren't honored the way battleships were. They were used up and then forgotten, which is sometimes the fate of the most effective tools of war. The boats are mostly gone now, but the idea behind them, the willingness to trust young leaders, to accept risk, to fight smart rather than big, That idea never truly disappeared. It just waits, quietly, like a wake fading behind a fast boat at night, long after the engines cut.